You've been following these developments. It was Saturday, I believe. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner group, he staged a mutiny, and it was essentially put down in 24 hours. There was negotiations with Lukashenko of Belarus, and now it appears that he's in Belarus. But during this mutiny, which I believe only had a very tiny minority of Wagner's total men, during this time, you had the collective West, you had Ukraine attempting to paint this as a civil war, you had the media do the same thing. All of the anti-Russia folks on social media were saying, this is a civil war, Russia's in real trouble. And now Putin has come out with a series of speeches, but his most latest speech, he talks about how much of a betrayal this was and how effective the response to this was. What do you think the impact of this is here from here on out? What will be the aftermath of this? Because there was a lot of heated debate about how Russia handled this and who was actually at fault for this. Was it Prigozhin? Was it the defense ministry, Shoigu and Gerasimov? And there's been a heated debate. So I'm wondering about your take on the situation, and where do you think that this is going to take the Ukraine conflict and Russia as a whole from here?
Well, I think the special military operation is going to continue as planned. I don't think this even remotely disrupted the special military operation. It was a festering problem. A lot of people, and I was on the fence on regarding this. Prigozhin had, very frequently grabbed headlines, was causing problems, was causing disruptions, was challenging the Ministry of Defense, which, he has fashioned himself as some sort of commander of the Wagner private military company. And he was on the battlefield, on the front lines, often very visible. But you can't do that. If you're a commander, you don't challenge the Ministry of Defense. That is insubordination. That's something that you could end up terminated entirely for. So he was a problem. And maybe because if you look at his history, has been involved in the Russian government for so long, he's worked his way up. He's a somewhat prominent figure, at least up until now. And maybe they just said, they understood that it was a problem, but at the time they felt he was doing more good than bad. But this was him crossing the line. We saw him escalating. Each time he would escalate more and more. And I think in his mind, he thought this was a reasonable escalation, although he quite clearly overplayed his hand, crossed too many lines, going to Rostov. They parked some military vehicles outside this headquarters building, and then sending a convoy to Moscow. I mean, what can you call that other than mutiny, insurrection, treason, as Russian President Vladimir Putin had said? And the aftermath, clearly, there's no change in the Ministry of Defense. This was Prigozhin's main issue. He wanted a shakeup in the Ministry of Defense. There was none. After Putin finished this, concluded with his speech about Prigozhin's going to Belarus, Wagner's being completely absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. He had a meeting with the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and all of the top guys were there, and so nothing changed. So Prigozhin got absolutely nothing out of this. He was liquidated administratively. He wasn't liquidated, not yet, entirely, but now he's in Belarus. Wagner is firmly under the control of the Ministry of Defense. It's not even Wagner anymore, I don't think, at least not as of right now. So I mean, that's where it is. And what is this show? The Western media is trying to portray this as illustrating the weakness of Russia. But I mean, everybody, when Russian President Vladimir Putin made his speech before noon, the day of this event, this incident, and he called it treason, he was saying to Prigozhin, I'm not siding with you on this, and I'm not tolerating this. This is it. You're done. And everyone in Russia, in the military, in the government, sided with the Russian president. I think the U.S. and the European Union, they would dream of being able to display such unity on any issue, let alone their proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So I don't think that was a demonstration of weakness. I think it was a demonstration of strength. Now, people are wondering, why didn't the Russian military just flatten Prigozhin and his convoy? And the reason is, if you watch Patrick Lancaster's video, he traveled 10 hours to Rostov to cover it in person. Hats off to him. And he was interviewing people. They love Wagner. They love Prigozhin. They also love the Ministry of Defense. They love the Russian president. They love everybody. They were happy that it was over with relatively little bloodshed. And this was the reason why the Russian government was so reasonable in the response to it. They did not want to escalate. They didn't want to create division. They didn't want to demoralize people by flattening a military force that has been considered heroes by the Russian people. They took Bakhmut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is quite astounding because there was a lot of anger. I mean, not just on social media, but there was, you could tell in terms of the response to those who have been following the special military operation, who support Russia's goals. You could see that there was some confusion and some anger about Prigozhin kind of being let go, so to speak. But at the same time, it might be understandable to feel that way, given that Putin himself said in the speech that Prigozhin's mutiny, the forces behind it, did kill several. We don't know how many, but he said several pilots, fighter pilots. And at the same time, what you're saying though is important, because what would it have looked like? In my opinion, I wonder what you think about this. In my opinion, it would have looked incredibly bad for Russia to get into an internal conflict that would have cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of people, if there was a direct confrontation between Russia's army, military, air force, and even the minority number of Wagner fighters that Prigozhin had behind him.
Yeah, I think it's important. You've made this point several times. I think it's important for people to understand this was a minority of the Wagner force. When it was happening, I was looking at the visual evidence, and it looked like maybe 1 or 2 battalions were involved. I've heard numbers as high as between 5, maybe 4 or 5,000 Wagner, but I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't seen a confirmed number of how many actually joined, but there's between 25 and maybe 38,000 Wagner fighters total. So that is a minority. That's very important to understand. And you're absolutely right. You don't want to be fighting, wasting ammunition, losing equipment, losing good men, men maybe roped into this unwittingly. Maybe they didn't really fully understand what they were doing. You don't want to be doing that while you're also fighting the combined power of NATO, because that's what Russia is doing. They're not fighting Ukraine. They're fighting NATO by proxy in Ukraine. So this is something you don't want to do. And a point that I tried to make, a point that on the Duran, Alex and Alexander often make, is that you can't just look at this in terms of military issues. You have to look at it diplomatically, economically, socially, politically. There's so many other dimensions that the Kremlin is looking at when they make decisions, like the speed of the special military operation. A lot of people complain that it's going too slow, but look at all of these other issues. It is not just a matter of military tactics, strategy, and moving across the battlefield. You also have to think about your allies, your economy, your trade with your allies, people that are on the fence worldwide. How can you win them over? So all of this is put into the equation. And that is something only the Kremlin can do, because they're the ones getting all of the information. Everyone else is just seeing a little slice of it. And another point I want to kind of make about Wagner, especially the maybe some of the fighters who joined Prigozhin on this misadventure, you have to think, when you're on the battlefield, you are just getting a small part of the picture. You might be asked to do things. You might be in a situation that you think is unfair, but the bigger picture, you're playing a crucial part, and the suffering that you're undergoing might actually be absolutely necessary and unavoidable in the grand scheme of things. And this is why militaries throughout human history, it's unquestioning obedience that is required from soldiers, because almost always you're being asked to do things to sacrifice for the greater good. And so I think this was a real problem Prigozhin was having, and this idea infected the minds of the people around him in Wagner.
Yeah, and that was quite clear for a while, because I remember back around the time where Prigozhin was announcing Bakhmut is about to fall. At the same time he was doing that, this was, I think, around the 1 year around the 1 year anniversary of the conflict. He was saying, he was coming out with a video that was just really disturbing, where he was going to dead bodies and saying, "This is your fault, Shoigu. This is your fault." I think he called out Grozmarov too, and said, "You're the reasons why this is happening." And it was very insubordinate. It was very problematic, because it was a very public statement that did make the rounds. But when it comes to Prigozhin and Wagner, I'm wondering about the reality behind this. Like, you've been following the conflict and what's been transpiring for a while militarily. How would you assess Prigozhin's criticisms? Because obviously his major problem was with Shoigu, was with the Ministry of Defense. What do you think about his criticisms, and how Russia is conducting this special military operation?
It's a good question, and it goes back to what does Prigozhin know versus what does the Kremlin know? What can the Kremlin see that Prigozhin cannot see? Obviously, Prigozhin isn't privy to all of the information that he needs to actually know for certain that the Ministry of Defense is running the special military operation poorly. I think that when you look at what's going on and you see in hindsight how everything has played out, I think Russia's approach is very appropriate. And again, I remember following the conflict in Syria from the very beginning, 2011, all the way to Russia's joining of the conflict in 2015 at the invitation of Damascus, and then the whole operation that Russia was conducting in Syria. And I remember the same exact criticisms. It's too slow. You're not being aggressive enough. These people should all die. Turkey should suffer and die in pain for because they were actually shooting down Russian planes,
Right.
ambushing rescue teams, and there was a lot of people who were livid, and they were condemning Russian President Putin and everybody around him. But as that played out, you see that they played that perfectly. It was strategy. It was giving up your instant gratification, your desire for revenge now for long-term victory, because Russia most certainly won that conflict. They and their Iranian and Syrian allies, they won that conflict by being patient, incrementally achieving their goals, thinking about the long term, thinking about geopolitics, as well as the conflict unfolding within and around Syria. And it's the exact same situation for Ukraine. As a matter of fact, it's much more complex. There's much more at stake. And this is why Russia is being careful. So I think Prigozhin was a loose cannon, and they finally tied him down. They're decommissioning him, so to speak.
And it's not a bad situation for him. I mean, Belarus is a beautiful country. He's going to be taken care of. But at the same time, he is accused of treason. And so he kind of, I think he got a pretty lucky break, as well as those who followed him. And to me, it was a genius move by Putin, because you both solidify and legitimize the integrity of what Wagner has done up until this point. And without Wagner, Russia would not be in the battlefield situation that it is in now, which is very favorable. So I think that was very smart to congratulate them, praise them, treat them well because of that, while at the same time being very firm about how this was just unacceptable and it was going to end one way or another. And Putin said himself, they stopped. It was the Wagner fighters themselves. They were not going to take another step into conflict, and we were able to diffuse it because there was an awareness of the consequences. Um, I'm just wondering though, where do you feel like this conflict changed in the sense that I think in the beginning, right up until the peace negotiations that took place, that Turkey mediated and the UK and the US and Ukraine scuttled, right up until then, it seemed like Russia was like, okay, we can just push and win, and they'll be forced to give up, and we'll come to a pretty good compromise that I think all sides will like. And I think Russia thought they had that, and Putin showed the paper recently to an African Union mission, say we had this signed, everyone signed it, this peace agreement. And then after that, it seemed like there was a realization that this was going to be a pretty long conflict. What changed? Like could you remind people? Because I think some of these emotional responses of Russia's got to go harder, smash Wagner, smash Ukraine, and the whole thing kind of gets, I think, a little bit naive when it comes to the realities on the ground. So what changed?
Well, again, a lot of people are hardliners. People that talk like this, they are hardliners, and they are only thinking about tactics, not even strategy, let alone logistics, which is extremely important. And then beyond that, geopolitics. But you're right that when Russia conceived the special military operation, they did not have just one plan. They had a multitude of contingencies. They wanted to rush in and panic Ukraine into surrendering. They wanted to surround Kiev, pressure Kiev to sign the deal. They also, obviously, and for years ahead of time, prepared for an extremely large, protracted, intense conflict. They obviously have the amounts of equipment and ammunition and also the industrial capacity to sustain the use of such a large force in such intense combat. So that they already knew that there was a good possibility, almost a certainty, that this was going to end up being a long war. They attempted these other contingencies in an attempt to shorten it, if possible. If you could have, panicked Ukraine into surrendering in the first week, you would have avoided all of these tens of thousands of deaths, injuries, the destruction of Ukraine, its infrastructure, its economy. You would have avoided all of that. So if there was even a small possibility of achieving that quickly and with little cost, why not give it a try? But at the same time, you've also for years prepared your military for a much larger and protracted conflict. And I believe that Russia has actually not only prepared for a protracted conflict as we see playing out, but they're also thinking about NATO intervention. Ultimately, that this is what they have in mind, and this is what they're thinking about. This is another reason why they're conducting the special military operation the way that they are. They're not going to, people want to see these big arrow offensives by Russia. Well, if they do that, they're going to have the same bad luck that Ukraine is having. You can't just drive tanks in a big arrow offensive through a minefield. You're going to take huge losses doing that, even if you provide air cover, artillery cover, and you try to demine and clear paths for your tanks. You're going to take a lot of losses. It's impossible not to take those losses. If they went ahead and did that to defeat the Ukrainian military right now, and then NATO intervened, then what? So people have to think this is like a chess game. When you play chess, you don't just look at the board as it is right now. You need to think several steps ahead, and several steps ahead for a multitude of scenarios. So this is like, it's a lot when you're a chess game is complicated enough, but this is the real world. This is geopolitics. This is on a global scale. So this is what the Kremlin is looking at. This is what's driving their decision making. They don't care about short-term gratifying victories on the battlefield. They care about long-term victory.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense, given that NATO itself has shown that that's what it wants, and so if it's been I know you've covered this, and maybe you can explain just how NATO has approached this conflict. It feels like that's what NATO has done. They've watched Ukraine go through one army after another, then they replenish the army, but not to the degree. And some of this has to do with NATO's own capabilities or lack thereof. But at the same time, NATO, where regardless of the reasons, it seems like NATO has concluded that, yeah, this is a long war itself, regardless of the various contradictory messages that comes out of various leaders within NATO, especially the US side usually, and Ukraine as well, outside of NATO, you saying many different kinds of things, really confident and going back. But it seems like the conclusion is the same, that this is going to be a grind. And that's what it's been so far. So what have you thought about NATO's approach to the conflict that can help us understand why Russia isn't necessarily, and the Ministry of Defense isn't necessarily keen on following someone like Prigozhin, so it's following those methods and tactics?
Well, NATO was encircling and containing both Russia and China, and they do it through a variety of ways. And most of their focus is, okay, yes, building up military capabilities, building up proxies like Ukraine militarily, but a lot of it is political games, the information warfare. The West's military capabilities have degraded over the last couple of decades. They've degraded and they have transformed into a force for fighting the small wars that the West has been fighting for the last 2 decades plus. And it's very, very difficult to switch from doing that to the type of footing that, say, Russia has and has had all along. I mean, Russia and the Soviet Union before the Russian Federation focused on massive land armies, air power, nuclear deterrent, but mainly huge amounts of tanks, artillery, and an industrial capacity to sustain the operation of these forces in a tense, large conflict. The West does not have these capabilities. Clearly, they do not. Honestly, I don't know what NATO is thinking. I don't know what Washington is thinking. They have these ambitions, but they do not have the ability to achieve them. And we see that playing out. You said they're going through one army after the other. Think about this offensive force that they created for Ukraine and look at the defenses that they're trying to breach. This is not a surprise. They're acting as if, oh, we're so surprised that Russia's defenses are so formidable. But I've read from the New York Times many, many times, over and over again, that article from December of last year about how massive the defenses were back then in December of last year. Layered defenses, minefields, dragon's teeth, tank traps of all kinds, and the positions they were creating for anti-tank weapons, their own tanks, their own artillery, everything that they were preparing over half a year ago. They did not create a force that is capable of effectively breaching those defenses and succeeding in their offensive. They didn't. But they sent all of this equipment and they encouraged Ukraine to do it anyway. So what are they thinking? I don't know. It's the same as what the U.S. has done in the Middle East or in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. They have been there for the last 2 decades in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Well, they're out of Afghanistan now. They invested so much in that. They were attempting to manipulate and control the entire region, and now they're being pushed out of it. So it just seems as if, again, they have these ambitions that their abilities prevent them from achieving, and yet they cannot think of some alternative view of the world and a way to organize their nation, their people, their resources to do something constructive. Instead, they're pursuing this dead-end foreign policy.